headlights appeared in my rearview mirror like twin specters, piercing the inky darkness of the deserted country road. Little did I know, those lights would haunt me for the rest of the night, and possibly the rest of my life. I'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the journey broken only by the occasional flicker of my headlights, catching a road sign, or the glint of an animal's eyes in the undergrowth. The radio had long since devolved into static, and my phone had lost signal miles ago. It was just me, my old Honda Civic, and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching out before me. When I first noticed the headlights behind me, I felt a mixture of relief and unease. On one hand, it was comforting to know I wasn't entirely alone out here in the middle of nowhere. On the other, something about the way those lights stayed perfectly centered in my mirror sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on the road ahead. The night was moonless, the darkness beyond my headlights an impenetrable wall. Trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, scraping against the sky. After about 10 minutes, I realized the car behind me hadn't changed position. It wasn't gaining on me, but it wasn't falling behind either. Just there, constant, unwavering. I pressed down on the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb. 55, 60, 65 miles per hour. The road was straight and empty, so I pushed it to 70. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white in the dim glow of the dashboard. A glance in the rearview mirror confirmed my fears. The headlights remained unchanged, keeping pace effortlessly. My heart began to race, thoughts spiraling into paranoia. Who were they? What did they want? I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe they were just using me as a guide, letting me watch for deer or other hazards. Maybe their speedometer was broken, and they were using me to gauge their speed. Maybe the excuses sounded hollow even in my own mind. I looked for landmarks, anything to give me a sense of where I was or how far I'd traveled. But there was nothing. No mile markers, no exits, no signs of civilization. Just the endless road and those relentless headlights. My palms were sweating now, slick against the steering wheel. I wiped them on my jeans, one hand at a time, never taking my eyes off the road for more than a second. The trees seemed to press in closer, the darkness between them hiding untold terrors. I thought about pulling over, but the idea of stopping filled me with dread. What if they stopped too? No. Better to keep moving, to maintain this bizarre status quo for as long as possible. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My eyes darted constantly between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The headlights never wavered, never flashed, never gave any indication of the driver's intentions. I tried to remember the last town I'd passed through, the last gas station, the last anything, but my mind was blank, filled only with the hypnotic line of the road and those ever-present lights. My fuel gauge caught my eye, and a new wave of panic washed over me. The needle was dipping dangerously close to empty. How long had I been driving? Surely I should have reached somewhere by now. As if sensing my distress, the car behind me suddenly sped up. The headlights grew larger in my mirror, looming closer with alarming speed. My foot instinctively pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine whining in protest as I pushed my old car to its limits. 80 miles per hour, 85, 90. The world outside became a blur, trees melting into a solid wall of darkness on either side. But still the headlights grew closer. I could make out details now. It was a large vehicle, probably an SUV or a truck. The headlights were set high, bearing down on me like the eyes of some monstrous predator. My car shuddered, the steering wheel vibrating in my grip. I'd never taken it this fast before, never had a reason to. A part of my mind screamed at me to slow down, that I was going to lose control. But a larger part, driven by pure animal fear, kept my foot pressed firmly on the accelerator. The speedometer needle trembled past 95 miles per hour. The engine roared, drowning out the sound of my ragged breathing and pounding heart. Sweat trickled down my back, my shirt clinging to my skin. And still, impossibly, the headlights drew closer. I chanced a longer look in the rearview mirror, trying to make out any details of the vehicle or its driver. That's when it happened. The impact came without warning, a thunderous crash of metal on metal. My car lurched forward, tires screeching as they struggled for purchase on the asphalt. The steering wheel was torn from my grasp as the car fishtailed wildly. Time seemed to slow. I saw the trees spinning around me, my headlights illuminating flashes of bark and leaves. I felt the car tilt, weight shifting as two wheels left the ground. There was a moment of weightlessness, a split second where I was suspended between earth and sky. Then gravity reasserted itself with brutal efficiency. The world tumbled end over end. Glass shattered, metal screamed. My seatbelt dug into my chest, holding me in place as everything else became a whirlwind of motion and chaos. When the movement finally stopped, I found myself hanging upside down, held in place by my seatbelt. Shards of glass glittered on the roof, now the floor of the car, catching the feeble light of my one remaining headlight. Pain blossomed across my body as the adrenaline began to fade. My head throbbed where it had struck the side window. Something warm trickled down my face, blood or sweat, I couldn't tell. I blinked, trying to clear my vision and make sense of what had happened. The inside of the car was a mess of deployed airbags, scattered belongings, and twisted metal. But beyond the shattered windshield, I could see the road. And on that road, illuminated by my car's dying headlight, stood a pair of boots. Fear, which had momentarily been displaced by the shock of the crash, came rushing back with redoubled intensity. I fumbled with my seatbelt, fingers clumsy and uncooperative. Every second felt like an eternity as I heard the slow, deliberate footsteps approaching my overturned vehicle. The buckle finally released, and I collapsed onto the roof in an ungraceful heap. Glass crunched beneath me as I scrambled to orient myself. Every movement sent waves of pain through my battered body, but terror was a powerful anesthetic. The footsteps stopped just outside the driver's side window. I held my breath, pressing myself against the passenger side door, as far away as I could get in the confined space. A hand appeared, gripping the window frame. Then, slowly, a figure began to lower itself, peering into the wreckage. In the dim, flickering light, I couldn't make out many details. It was a man, that much I could tell, broad-shouldered and tall, his face hidden in shadow. He said nothing as he surveyed the inside of the car, his head turning slowly until his gaze fell on me. I wanted to scream, to beg, to demand answers. But my voice was trapped somewhere in my chest, unable to push past the lump of fear in my throat. The man reached into the car, his arm extending towards me. I pressed myself harder against the door, feeling the handle digging into my back. My mind raced, trying to formulate a plan, an escape route, anything. His hand stopped just short of touching me. Instead, he pointed, a single finger extended past me towards the passenger side. Against every instinct, I turned to look. The passenger window was gone, shattered in the crash. Beyond it, I could see a steep embankment leading down into darkness. But more importantly, I could see freedom. I looked back at the man, confusion warring with fear. He withdrew his hand and stood up, disappearing from view. For a long moment, I remained frozen, unsure of what to do. Then I heard it, sirens in the distance, growing louder. The sound spurred me into action, ignoring the protest of my battered body. I crawled across the glass-strewn roof and out through the broken window. The cold night air hit me like a physical blow, clearing some of the fog from my mind. I looked up towards the road, but the man was gone. There was no sign of the vehicle that had been following me, no evidence of the collision that had sent me tumbling off the road. The sirens were getting closer. Red and blue lights painted the trees in an otherworldly glow. I looked down the embankment, into the thick undergrowth that promised concealment. Then I looked back towards the approaching lights. In that moment, I made a choice, one that I've questioned every day since. I ran, I plunged into the darkness, branches whipping at my face, thorns tearing at my clothes. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. I ran until the sirens faded into the distance, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. When I finally stopped, collapsing against a tree, I was hopelessly lost. The events of the night replayed in my mind, each replay bringing more questions than answers. Who was the man in the SUV? Why had he chased me? Why had he pointed towards the escape route instead of attacking me? And why had I run from the approaching police? As the adrenaline faded and the pain of my injuries made itself known, I realized the night was far from over. I was alone in the woods, injured, without a phone or any idea where I was. But I was alive, and as I looked up at the stars peeking through the canopy above, I made a vow. I would find answers. I would understand what had happened on that lonely stretch of road. Little did I know, that night was just the beginning of a mystery that would consume my life. A mystery that, even now, I'm not sure I want solved. Because some truths are better left in the dark, where the headlights can't find them. The moment my GPS told me to turn onto that unmarked dirt road, I should have known something was wrong. But exhaustion and the promise of a shortcut clouded my judgment, leading me down a path I'll never forget, if I survived to remember it. It had been a long day of driving, the kind where the hours blend together into a monotonous blur of asphalt and faded yellow lines. I was on my way to visit my sister in a small town I'd never been to before, relying heavily on my phone's GPS to guide me through the unfamiliar landscape. As night fell, the world outside my car windows transformed. The comforting glow of streetlights and neon signs gave way to an oppressive darkness, broken only by my headlights and the occasional reflective road sign. The radio, which had been my constant companion, faded to static, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the low hum of my engine. I was just starting to wonder if I should find a motel for the night when my GPS chimed, instructing me to turn right in 500 feet. I slowed down, peering through the windshield for any sign of a road. There was nothing but dense forest on either side of me. Then, just as I was about to pass it, my headlights caught the barest hint of a gap in the trees. No sign, no markings, just a narrow dirt track leading off into darkness. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the turn signal. This couldn't be right, but the GPS insisted, the robotic voice urging me to turn now. Fatigue whispered in my ear, reminding me how nice it would be to reach my destination sooner rather than later. With a sigh, I flicked on my turn signal. Out of habit more than necessity, there wasn't another car in sight, and carefully steered onto the dirt road. The change was immediate and unsettling. The smooth asphalt gave way to a rough, uneven surface that made my car bounce and shudder. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches scraping against my windows like skeletal fingers. My headlights seemed dimmer somehow, as if the darkness was actively resisting their attempt to pierce it. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, leaning forward as if those few extra inches would help me see better. The GPS continued to guide me, but its confident in 500 feet, turn left felt increasingly out of place in this wild, untamed environment. After a few minutes of slow, careful driving, I noticed my phone's signal bars dropping. One by one, they disappeared until the no service message mocked me from the top of the screen. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air seeping in through my car's aging weather stripping. I was about to turn around, GPS be damned, when the dirt road suddenly widened, opening into a small clearing. My headlights swept across the space, revealing nothing. No houses, no other roads, just more trees and what looked like the remnants of an old campfire. The GPS chimed again, cheerfully announcing, "You have arrived at your destination." I let out a nervous laugh that sounded too loud in the confines of my car. This was ridiculous. Clearly, the GPS had malfunctioned. I needed to turn around and get back to the main road, but as I put the car in reverse, my headlights flickered. once, twice, then went out completely. My breath caught in my throat as I was plunged into total darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, flicking it back and forth frantically. Nothing. The engine was still running. I could feel the vibration through the steering wheel, but every electrical system in the car seemed to have died. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone. Its screen was dark and unresponsive. Dead battery, but I'd just been using it for GPS. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness outside my car. I froze, straining my ears. The forest, which had seemed so silent before, now came alive with small sounds. The rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, and something else. Something that sounded unsettlingly like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I wrestled with indecision. Stay in the car where it was safe, or make a run for it into the unknown forest. Neither option seemed particularly appealing. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied now by a strange shuffling sound. It was coming from directly in front of my car, where my headlights had been pointing just moments ago. I held my breath, pressing myself back against the seat as if I could somehow melt into it and disappear. The shuffling stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness that was somehow worse. Then, a thud against my hood. I bit back a scream, my hand flying to my mouth. Another thud, harder this time. The car rocked slightly with the impact. In desperation, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine, which had been idling this whole time, roared to life with renewed vigor. And miraculously, beautifully, the headlights blazed back to life. For a split second, I saw them. Dark figures, at least 3, standing in front of my car. Their features were lost in shadow, but I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting the sudden light, like animals caught in a hunter's torch. Then they were gone, diving to the sides faster than seemed humanly possible. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed the car into drive and floored the accelerator. The tires spun in the dirt before finding purchase, and I shot forward into the trees. Branches whipped against the windshield as I careened down the narrow path. I had no idea if this was the way I'd come, but at that moment, I didn't care. All that mattered was putting distance between me and whatever I'd seen in that clearing. My phone suddenly came back to life, its screen blazing in the darkness. The GPS recalculated, then directed me to turn left in 100 feet. I almost laughed, as if I was going to trust it again after what had just happened. But as my headlights swept around a bend, I saw it. A left turn, the dirt road intersecting with blessed, beautiful asphalt. I took the turn so fast my tires squealed in protest. The smooth surface of the paved road felt like a homecoming. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, watching with grim satisfaction as the speedometer climbed. It wasn't until I saw the lights of a gas station in the distance that I finally let myself relax. Just a little. My hands were shaking as I pulled into the brightly lit parking lot. I sat there for a long moment, engine idling, trying to process what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Some kind of waking nightmare, brought on by exhaustion and an overactive imagination? But no! The scratches on my car from the tree branches were real enough. And when I finally worked up the courage to get out and check the hood, there were distinct dents where something had struck it. I went into the gas station on unsteady legs, probably looking like a wild woman with my disheveled hair and wide eyes. The bored-looking clerk perked up as I approached the counter. "Excuse me," I said, my voice hoarse. "Can you tell me where I am?" He gave me the name of a town I'd never heard of, one that definitely wasn't where my sister lived. "How far is it to Millbrook?" I asked, naming my original destination. The clerk's eyebrows shot up. "Millbrook? That's like 3 hours north of here. How'd you end up this far off course?" I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it again. How could I possibly describe what had just happened? Instead, I asked, "Is there a dirt road around here?" "One that goes into the woods." The clerk's expression changed, a flicker of something passing over his face. "There's lots of dirt roads around here," he said carefully. But if you're talking about the one I think you are, my advice would be to stay far away from it. Why? I pressed, leaning forward. What's out there? He shook his head. Nothing good. Folks around here know better than to go down that road, especially at night. He paused, studying my face. You saw something, didn't you? I nodded slowly. He sighed, reaching under the counter. For a moment I tensed, but he just pulled out a business card and handed it to me. Look, if you really want answers, talk to this guy. He's been investigating the weird stuff that happens around here for years. I looked at the card. Paranormal investigator. It proclaimed in bold letters above a phone number. Thanks, I said, tucking the card into my pocket. I think I'll give him a call. As I walked back to my car, my mind was reeling. Part of me wanted to just drive away, to pretend this night had never happened and get back to my normal life. But a larger part, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and unanswered questions, knew I couldn't let this go. Those figures in the woods, the strange behavior of my electronics, the warning from the clerk, it all added up to something bigger than a simple wrong turn. I had a choice to make. I could continue on to my sister's house, stick to my original plan, and try to forget about this terrifying detour. Or I could stay, dig deeper, and try to uncover the truth about what lurked down that dark, unmarked road. As I started my car, I realized the choice had already been made. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the card. Whatever was out there in those woods, whatever forces were at play in this strange little town, I was going to find out. And maybe, just maybe, I'd live to tell the tale. The phone rang once, twice, then a gruff voice answered. Paranormal Investigations, how can I help you? I took a deep breath and plunged into my story, unknowingly taking the first step on a journey that would change my life forever. The moment I saw those eyes glowing in my rearview mirror, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. But by then, it was already too late. The night had started innocently enough. I was driving home from a late shift at the hospital, my scrub still reeking of antiseptic and exhaustion. The rain had been relentless all day, turning the world outside into a shimmering, blurry mess. My windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, and I leaned forward in my seat, squinting to make out the road ahead. That's when I saw him. A lone figure stood on the side of the road, thumb outstretched, clothes plastered to his body by the rain. In the brief flash of my headlights, I caught a glimpse of a young face, probably early 20s, with a mop of dark hair plastered to his forehead. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. In fact, I never do, but something about the miserable scene before me tugged at my heartstrings. Maybe it was the lingering effects of a 12-hour shift spent helping people, or maybe it was just the thought of how I'd feel if it were my own son standing out there in the rain. Whatever the reason, I found myself slowing down, pulling over to the shoulder of the road. The figure approached quickly, and before I could second-guess my decision, he was opening the passenger door and sliding into my car. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain and the suddenly deafening silence of my turned-off radio. "I really appreciate it." I nodded, trying to get a better look at my unexpected passenger as I pulled back onto the road. He was younger than I'd initially thought, maybe 19 or 20. His clothes were nondescript, jeans, a dark hoodie, sneakers. Nothing unusual, except for how utterly soaked they were. "Where you headed?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. The rain seemed to be getting worse, if that was possible. "Just up the road a ways," he replied vaguely. "I'll let you know when to turn off." I frowned slightly at the non-answer but didn't push it. We drove in silence for a few minutes. The only sounds the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the drumming of rain on the roof. "So," I said, mostly to break the uncomfortable silence, "what had you out in weather like this?" He didn't respond immediately, and when I glanced over, I found him staring straight ahead, his face oddly blank. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with my damp clothes or the car's struggling heater. "Car broke down," he said finally, still not looking at me. Guess I should have checked the weather forecast, huh? I forced a chuckle, but it sounded hollow even to my own ears. Something fell off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I tried to focus on the road, on getting us both safely to wherever we were going, but I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. The minutes ticked by, and I became increasingly aware of how far we'd driven from the main highway. The roads were getting narrower, the houses fewer and farther between. Just as I was about to suggest maybe turning back, the hitchhiker spoke. "Take the next right," he said, his voice startlingly loud in the confined space of the car. I jumped slightly, then nodded, slowing down to make the turn. The road he'd indicated was little more than a dirt track, barely visible in the gloom. "You sure about this?" I asked, hesitating at the turn. "Doesn't look like there's much down here." "I'm sure," he said, and there was something in his tone that brooked no argument. Against my better judgment, I turned onto the dirt road. The car bounced and slid in the mud, and I had to grip the steering wheel tightly to keep us on track. The trees pressed in close on either side, their branches scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers. We drove like this for what felt like an eternity, though my dashboard clock told me it had only been about 10 minutes. The hitchhiker remained silent, staring straight ahead. I opened my mouth several times to speak, to ask where exactly we were going, but each time the words died in my throat. Finally, unable to take the silence any longer, I glanced over at my passenger. "Look, I don't mean to be rude, but how much further is this place of yours? I really should be getting home." And the words froze on my lips as I caught sight of his eyes in the reflection of the passenger window. They were glowing, actually glowing, like a cat's eyes caught in a flashlight beam. But there was no light source, nothing to explain the eerie, yellow-green luminescence. I must have made some sort of sound, because he turned to look at me. In the dim light of the dashboard, his eyes looked normal. Dark, perhaps a bit too dark, but normal. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone concerned but with an undercurrent of something else. Amusement? Anticipation? "Why, yeah," I stammered, forcing my eyes back to the road. "Just thought I saw something. Probably just tired." He nodded slowly, still watching me. "It's not much further," he said. "Just around the next bend." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stop the car, to turn around, to get as far away from the situation as possible. But a larger part of me, the part that had made me stop for this stranger in the first place, insisted that I was overreacting, that my overtired mind was playing tricks on me. We rounded the bend, and I saw a dilapidated old house looming out of the darkness. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. Windows broken, paint peeling, porch sagging dangerously. "This is it," the hitchhiker said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "You can stop here." I brought the car to a stop, the headlights illuminating the decrepit structure before us. Despite the rain and the lateness of the hour, I made no move to turn off the engine. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his hand on the door handle. "I really appreciate it." I nodded mutely, my hand still gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. He opened the door, letting in a gust of cold, damp air. But he didn't get out immediately. Instead, he turned back to me, and in the harsh glare of the dome light, I saw his eyes clearly for the first time. They were glowing again, but this time there was no mistaking it. No way to explain it away as a trick of the light or my imagination. "You know," he said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather most people would have driven right by, "it's nice to know there are still good Samaritans in the world." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring into those impossible, inhuman eyes. He smiled then, and I saw that his teeth were just a little too sharp, a little too numerous. It almost makes me feel bad about this. Almost, in a movement almost too fast to follow, he reached out and grasped my arm. His touch was ice cold and unnaturally strong. I tried to pull away, but it was like being gripped by a steel vise. "What dash?" I finally managed to gasp out, but he cut me off. "Sure," he said, almost gently. "It'll be over soon. And hey, look on the bright side. You're about to be part of something much bigger than yourself." As he spoke, I became aware of movement outside the car. Shadows detached themselves from the darkness around the old house, moving with a fluid grace that was decidedly inhuman. They approached the car, and in the feeble glow of my headlights, I caught glimpses of more glowing eyes, more two sharp teeth. The hitchhiker's grip on my arm tightened, and I felt a strange numbness spreading from the point of contact. My vision began to blur, the world around me growing fuzzy and indistinct. The last thing I remember clearly is the hitchhiker's voice, sounding as if it were coming from very far away. "Welcome to the family," he said, and then the darkness closed in. I wish I could say that I fought back, that I managed some daring escape. But the truth is I didn't. I couldn't. Whatever he was, whatever they were, it was beyond my ability to resist. Sometimes, in my more lucid moments, I wonder if anyone noticed I was missing. If my colleagues at the hospital raised the alarm when I didn't show up for my next shift. If the police found my abandoned car on that lonely dirt road. But mostly, I try not to think about the world I left behind. It's easier that way, easier to accept my new reality. Because the truly terrifying thing, the thing that keeps me awake during the long, dark days when we sleep, is not what happened to me. It's the knowledge that somewhere out there, on some rainy night, another tired driver will see a lonely figure standing by the side of the road. And they'll slow down, thinking they're doing a good deed. And the cycle will begin again. So if you're driving late at night and you see someone looking for a ride, remember my story. Keep driving. Don't slow down. Don't look back. Because sometimes, the real monsters are the ones we invite into our lives with the best of intentions. And by the time you realize your mistake, it's already too late. The flash of hazard lights pierced the darkness like a warning. If only I'd heeded it. Instead, I slowed down, my misguided compassion sealing my fate in ways I could never have imagined. It was just past midnight, and I was driving home from a friend's birthday party. The night was clear, a rarity for our usually foggy town, and the stars twinkled overhead like distant, cold observers. The road stretched out before me, empty and inviting, a black ribbon cutting through the sleeping landscape. I hadn't been drinking, designated driver duties and all that, but I was tired. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from pretending to have fun when all you want is your bed. My eyelids felt heavy, and I had to keep shaking myself awake. In retrospect, maybe that's why I didn't see it coming. The hazard lights appeared suddenly, blinking urgently on the shoulder of the road about a quarter mile ahead. As I drew closer, I could make out the silhouette of a car, its front end dipped at an odd angle. Probably a blown tire, I thought. I slowed down, more out of habit than conscious decision. Growing up in a small town, you're taught to help your neighbors, even if those neighbors are strangers stranded on the side of the road. Besides, I reasoned, what if it were me stuck out here in the middle of the night? As my headlights swept across the scene, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart skip a beat. There, just behind the car, was a dark shape on the ground, a person lying motionless. "Oh, God!" I muttered, immediately pulling over. My tiredness evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. I fumbled for my phone, ready to call 911, but hesitated. What if they were just working on the car? I didn't want to look like an idiot calling emergency services for nothing. I decided to check it out first. After all, I had basic first aid training from my summer job as a lifeguard. If someone was hurt, I could at least help until the real professionals arrived. Leaving my engine running and headlights on, I stepped out of the car. The night air was cool against my skin, carrying the scent of pine from the nearby forest. Everything was eerily quiet, save for the tick-tick-tick of the hazard lights and the low rumble of my car's engine. "Hello," I called out, approaching cautiously. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" No response. I moved closer, my eyes fixed on the prone figure. It was definitely a person, lying face down on the asphalt. They were wearing dark clothes, making it hard to see any details in the dim light. My heart was pounding now, a mix of fear and concern. I knelt down beside them, reaching out to check for a pulse like I'd been taught. "Hey, can you hear me? I'm going to call for help, okay?" That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, that sent a chill down my spine. Footsteps, coming fast, from the woods. I looked up, squinting into the darkness beyond my headlights. For a split second, I saw nothing. Then, a figure burst from the tree line, moving within human speed straight towards me. Time seemed to slow down. I could see every detail with startling clarity. The figure was tall, easily over 6 feet, with long, gangly limbs that moved in a jerky, unnatural way. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting the light, glowing like a wild animal's. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I scrambled to my feet, nearly tripping over the injured person who was now very much alive and reaching for my ankles. I ran, harder and faster than I'd ever run in my life. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly, but pure terror propelled me forward. I could hear them behind me, both of them now, their footsteps unnaturally quick and light. My car was only yards away, but it felt like miles. I fumbled with the keys in my pocket, praying I wouldn't drop them. Just as I reached for the door handle, something grabbed the back of my jacket. I screamed, a sound of pure, primal fear that tore from my throat. With strength I didn't know I possessed, I wrenched myself free, feeling the fabric tear. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut just as a hand slapped against the window. The face that peered in at me wasn't human, at least not entirely. The proportions were all wrong. The skin too pale, the mouth too wide with too many teeth. But the eyes were the worst part. They were filled with a hungry intelligence that chilled me to my core. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into drive, my foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. The tires squealed as I took off, fishtailing slightly on the empty road. In my rear-view mirror, I could see the two figures standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. They made no attempt to chase, no move to pursue. They just stood there. I drove like a maniac, way too fast for the winding country roads, but I couldn't bring myself to slow down. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It couldn't be real. People don't just lie in wait to attack random passers-by. And they certainly don't move like that, or look like that. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of town that I finally allowed myself to ease off the gas. My hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, and I was drenched in cold sweat. I should go to the police, I thought. Report what happened. But even as the idea formed, I dismissed it. What would I say? That I was almost attacked by monsters pretending to be stranded motorists? They'd think I was drunk or on drugs. No, I decided I'd go home, lock the doors, and try to convince myself it was all some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing. But as I pulled into my driveway, I knew deep down that it had been real. The torn jacket in my back seat was proof enough of that. I locked myself in the house, double-checking every window and door. Sleep was out of the question, so I sat in my living room with all the lights on, jumping at every little sound. As the adrenaline wore off, the questions started flooding in. What were those things? Why had they tried to attack me? And most chillingly, how many other people had fallen for their trap? The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon when I heard a knock at my door. I froze, my heart rate immediately spiking. There was no way they could have followed me home, right? Cautiously, I approached the door, peering through the peephole. To my immense relief, I saw a police officer standing on my porch. He looked tired, his uniform slightly rumpled as if he'd been up all night. I opened the door, trying to keep my hand from shaking. Can I help you, officers? He gave me a weary smile. Good morning, ma'am. Sorry to bother you so early, but we're canvassing the neighborhood. There was an incident on Highway 16 last night, and we're checking if anyone saw anything unusual. My blood ran cold. Highway 16. That's where I'd been, where I'd seen them. What kind of incident? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The officer's expression turned grim. A couple was attacked at their broken-down vehicle. The husband didn't make it. The wife is in critical condition, but she managed to give us a description of the attackers before she lost consciousness. I felt like I was going to be sick. What did she say? He pulled out a small notebook. This is going to sound crazy, but she insisted there were two of them, said they moved inhumanly fast and had eyes that glowed in the dark. He shook his head. Poor woman was probably in shock. Probably just some sick individuals taking advantage of a vulnerable situation. I nodded numbly, not trusting myself to speak. Anyway, he continued, if you saw or heard anything unusual last night, even if it seems unrelated, please give us a call. He handed me a card with the police station's number. I took it, managing a weak thank you, officer. As he turned to leave, a thought struck me. Wait, I called out. What time did this happen? He checked his notes. The 911 call came in at 12:43 a.m. Why? Did you hear something around that time? I shook my head. No, I was at a friend's party until after 1 a.m. Just curious. He nodded, seemingly satisfied, and left. I closed the door, leaning against it as my legs threatened to give out. 12:43 a.m. At least 20 minutes before I drove by, which meant they were waiting for me, or someone like me, someone who would stop to help. The realization hit me like a physical blow. If I had arrived just a little earlier, it would have been me on that road. Me, instead of that poor couple. As I sank to the floor, my mind reeling with the implications, one thing became crystal clear. I could never look at a stranded motorist the same way again. The next time I saw hazard lights blinking in the darkness, I wouldn't slow down. I'd speed up, because now I knew the truth. Sometimes, the real monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They're standing right there in the light, waiting for someone kind enough or foolish enough to stop and help. And I'd been lucky enough to escape. This time. The sickening thud as we hit something on that pitch-black stretch of highway turned our petty argument into a nightmare. In that moment, I didn't realize our lives were about to change forever, or that the real horror was yet to come. It had been a long day. My wife, Sarah, and I were driving back from her parents' house, a trip we made every other month out of obligation rather than desire. The visit had been tense as usual. Her father's passive-aggressive comments about my job, her mother's not-so-subtle hints about grandchildren. It was all fuel for the argument that had been simmering between us since we got in the car. I just don't understand why you can't stand up to them, I said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating an empty road ahead. Sarah sighed, staring out the passenger window. They're my parents, Tom. What do you want me to do? Cut them off completely? Of course not, I snapped. But would it kill you to defend me once in a while? She turned to face me, her eyes flashing with anger. Defend you? From what, exactly? A few harmless comments. Harmless? I laughed bitterly. Your dad practically called me a failure to my face. He did not. Her words were cut off by a sudden impact. Something large at the front of our car with a sickening thud. The vehicle lurched, and I instinctively slammed on the brakes, sending us into a skid. For a moment, everything was chaos. The screech of tires, Sarah's scream, the world spinning outside our windows. Then, abruptly, stillness. We sat there, both breathing heavily, the only sound the tick-tick-tick of the engine cooling. What was that? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I don't know. An animal, maybe? But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The impact had been too big, too solid for a deer or a coyote. With shaking hands, I unbuckled my seatbelt. Stay here, I told Sarah. I'm going to check. Tom, no. But I was already opening the door, the cool night air rushing in. The smell of burned rubber filled my nostrils as I stepped onto the asphalt. Our headlights were still on, casting long shadows on the road behind us. And there, about 20 feet back, was a dark shape lying motionless on the ground. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached. With each step, the shape became clearer, resolving into a horrifyingly familiar form. A person. We had hit a person. Oh, God, I muttered, my legs threatening to give out. Oh, God, no. I knelt beside the figure, a man. I could see now. He was face down, one arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood pooled beneath him, black in the dim light. With trembling fingers, I reached for his neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. Tom! Sarah's voice came from behind me, shaky and uncertain. Tom, what is it? I turned to see her standing a few feet away, her face pale in the headlights. Call 911, I said, my own voice sounding strange and distant to my ears. Now, she nodded, fumbling for her phone. As she dialed, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The distant but unmistakable wail of a siren. Panic gripped me. This was bad. This was so bad. We had killed someone. An accident, yes, but would anyone believe that? We had been arguing. I had been distracted. And now a man was dead. They're on their way, Sarah said, lowering the phone. She took a step closer, then stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth as she saw the body. Is he? I nodded grimly. Yeah, he's gone. The siren was getting louder now. We had maybe a minute, perhaps less, before whoever was arrived. In that moment, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Get in the car, I said, standing up. Sarah stared at me, uncomprehending. What? We can't just. Get in the cars, I repeated, more forcefully this time. Now. Something in my tone must have convinced her, because she turned and ran back to the passenger side. I took one last look at the man we had hit, silently begging for forgiveness, then sprinted to the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I floored the accelerator. The tires squealed as we took off, leaving behind a scene that would play out in my nightmares for years to come. We drove in silence. The only sound the rush of wind through Sarah's cracked window and the pounding of my own heart. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see flashing lights in pursuit. But there was nothing, just darkness. After about 10 minutes, Sarah finally spoke. What have we done? Her voice was hollow, devoid of the anger from earlier. Now there was only fear and disbelief. We didn't have a choice, I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. You saw that siren. If we had stayed, we could have explained, she said weakly. It was an accident. I shook my head. Think about it, Sarah. We'd both been drinking at your parents'. Not enough to be over the limit, but enough. We were arguing. I was distracted. How do you think that would have looked? She didn't respond, just turned to stare out the window again. I could see tears streaming down her cheeks, illuminated by the occasional passing streetlight. We drove for hours, neither of us speaking. I had no destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to put as much distance between us and that lonely stretch of highway as possible. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon that I finally pulled over at a rest stop. We sat there, the engine idling, both lost in our own thoughts. What do we do now? Sarah asked, her voice hoarse from crying. I rubbed my eyes, exhaustion settling over me like a heavy blanket. I don't know, I admitted. We can't go home. They'll be looking for us there. So we just run? Forever? The reality of our situation hit me then. There was no going back. No undoing what we'd done. We were fugitives now, bound together by a terrible secret. We don't have a choice, I said softly. Sarah nodded, resigned. I'll need to call my work. Make up some excuse. Yeah, I agreed. Me too. We'll need money, and we should ditch our phones as soon as possible. Get burner phones instead. We sat there for a while longer, making plans in hushed voices. It was surreal, like we were characters in some crime drama rather than ourselves. But this was our reality now. As the sun rose higher in the sky, painting the world in soft pinks and golds, we pulled back onto the highway. I didn't know where we were going, only that we couldn't stop, couldn't look back. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. We moved from town to town, taking odd jobs, always looking over our shoulders. The guilt never left us, a constant companion that colored every moment of our new life. We saw the news reports, of course, the hit and run that left a beloved community member dead, the grieving family pleading for justice. Each new development was like a knife twisting in my gut. Sarah and I grew closer in some ways, the shared burden of our secret creating a bond that nothing could break. But in other ways, we drifted apart. The carefree couple we had once been was gone, replaced by two haunted individuals just trying to survive. Sometimes, late at night, I would lie awake and imagine what would have happened if we had stayed. If we had faced the consequences of our actions, would it have been better? Worse? There was no way to know. 1 year to the day after the accident, we found ourselves in a small coastal town, as far from that fateful highway as we could get. We stood on the beach, watching the sun set over the ocean. Do you think we'll ever be able to stop running? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the crashing waves. I took her hand, feeling the weight of all we had been through in that simple gesture. I don't know, I said honestly, but whatever happens, we're in this together. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the sky, I thought about the man we had hit, about the life we had taken and the lives we had destroyed, including our own. And I realized that some mistakes can never be undone. Some bells can never be unrung. We had made our choice that night on the highway. Now we had to live with it, for better or for worse, until the day our luck ran out or our consciences finally broke us. And as we walked back to our latest temporary home, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, karma was waiting, and sooner or later, it would catch up to us. The only question was, will we be ready when it did?